The acute stress reaction must have resulted in a first-time seizure and the dissociative stupor that followed. I was unable to make appropriate responses to the nudges of the man who stood over me as I lay across the planter. The police officer scrutinized me under the beam of a flashlight. Then he worked the key in the door and let himself in. A moment later, I heard his transceiver crackle inside. I think I tried to pull my legs into the planter at some point. Or did I try to heave myself to my feet by holding on to the rim? A long time had passed, it seemed, with the building still in silence and darkness. Zoe's door was closed again, and I remember gripping the plants and groaning in the dark. I cannot say how long. Then I heard the deep guttural sounds in the stairwell, someone sitting on the stairs above. Those were echoes of my own terrified, fitful breathing, but I did not know that then. I had no sense of inner space, the place inside me where my consciousness began. Then, all of a sudden, the waves of hell commenced to crash into the building, and once again everything changed in a matter of seconds. First, there was the shrill clang of the front door in the vestibule downstairs, the heart-rending clamor of the tactical unit in the stairs, their lights dancing in the staircase like silver shafts. Those who had gotten in through the roof were already positioned on the flight of stairs just above Zoe's landing, pointing their weapons at me through the banister, shouting down incomprehensible warnings. Two of them eventually made their way down to the landing and shouted more things at me in peremptory but less aggressive tones. As it turned out, there was a third man behind them holding up a round light on a staff. When I did not respond, the two officers pulled me up from the planter and frisked me vigorously. Their guns looked like absurd, unnecessarily complicated toys. Their night vision goggles crab-eyed on top of the robotic headgear, their Kevlar uniforms thick and bristly and prehistoric-looking, like synthetic hides of amusement park dinosaurs. Eventually, they let go of me, their voices distorted into throaty, gargling jumble as soon as they lowered their visors. I gradually sank down and slumped against the wall between the plants and the stairs, where more black uniformed figures were coming down. Zoe's door was now wide open again, and the landing and stairs teemed with them, RAID or GIPN men in tactical gear, called in by the Attorney General to clear the building for the officers of the Brigade Criminale. A few of them were talking into their mouthpieces, incomprehensible staccatos, SMR-distorted exchanges. When their commander declared the building safe, they ordered paramedics into the apartment to take away Samia. Then it was the brigade's turn. I was still disoriented and had no sense of space or time when the two uniformed policemen helped me up from the spot where I had wedged myself by the stairs. I still had no sense of the limits of my mind either. I was suffering with loss of vitality, and my body felt hollow and weak, as if from an electric shock. I remember the moment when Colin stood before me in the semi-dark landing. He looked as if he were wearing two round pieces of mirrored glass on his eyes, probably the reflection from someone's flashlight in his oval rimless glasses. He must have tried to address me in some way, but I was standing unsteadily between the two policemen, and I did not say a word. He did not have time to wait for my words either. His men were already sealing the scene. For some reason, with the light coming across the doorway now, I was beginning to see them all through a sort of reddish-black aura. They were all jarring and menacing and ominous-seeming, their sounds shrill and penetrating. These shadowy red men caught in the insanity of their bustle-like frenzy backstage actors. There was another man with Colin, possibly the police prefect. The lead investigator, who was a commissar de police, stepped aside and let him in first with a deferential gesture. They were followed by Colin's aides, then the experts of the police technique scientific, somber men with sinister white gloves and stacks of brown bag envelopes, and their ponderous, incomprehensible equipment. It came in black cases of various sizes that made them look like musicians. There were two white-clad and gloved men, each holding a stack of dull white plastic receptacles with thick numbers stenciled in phosphorescent orange. I stood there and looked on as the two policemen held me. Was it a routine gesture, or did they decide that I might try to run away? And then, during those unreal minutes, something happened that I had always retained in my memory, in my dream thoughts and in my waking thoughts, well before the work of recall under hypnosis. The only words from that evening that I remember hearing in full clarity: a man with a black inscribed red armband was talking on a cellular phone. I recall the rectangle glowing a phosphorescent aqua blue in his hands as he tried to put all the din behind him, leaning far out over the rail of the banister, like a careless boy, his hand cupped over his ear. Apparently, somebody somewhere in the outside world was worrying about the size of the building, and the red-sleeved man was working on allaying their concerns, even as he peered into the dark downward gape of the stairwell, as if he was testing how far out he could lean over before he went over. The officer was almost shouting into his cell phone, hopelessly trying to be authoritative and convincing in the middle of the madness. "We're working on the lights. The stairs are very roomy. Believe me, it is an old building with a very wide, roomy staircase. No, the landing is huge. We'll let you know when we're through." He was so close that I could have reached out and touched him. This man's whose inscrutable words are the only utterances I have kept safely locked in my memory all along. All at once, I began to shake and whimper. "It's all gone," I remember saying. The reaction of the two officers was to turn me around and help me sit down on the stairs. One of them leaned over me and tried to tell me something, but all I could register were the distortions of his face through the translucent rim of the reddish-black aura. That face looked like an empty rubber mask wobbling without support. His colleague was shouting something on the transceiver as the men of the brigade ran in and out of the apartment. As I sat on the stairs, I suddenly began to feel that I literally did not know where to turn, that I was literally about to lose my head. Was the building going to be invaded by another onslaught of piercing cacophony? Or maybe it was just my head, my nerves imploding in the cavernous recesses of my mind. I put my hand over my ears and sat with my face cradled between my knees. Time kept pounding and grinding inside of me, its horrid, inhuman relentlessness. I was drowning on the stairs, hugging my shins hard with my face pressed against my knees. I wound up instinctively trying to revert to the fetal position to keep myself from flying apart, but the pressure was choking the air from my lungs and creating further anguish. Now the paramedic called in by the officer stood before us with an orange kit in one hand and a thermal blanket in the other. She laid down the kit and put her hand on my arm. One of the officers helped me to stand up. Then he walked down one flight with me, helped me sit down the stairs, and stepped aside for the paramedic, who spread out the thermal blanket on the floor and had me lie down on my back. I do not remember what she was telling me as I lay down in the dark, but I know that her words had to do with the pace of my breathing. She kept reminding me to breathe, to control my rhythm, to hold the air within my chest for a few seconds, to visualize my chest expanding with my breathing. Many times she had to hold me down and keep me on my back when I grew agitated and wanted to go back to the fetal position. She kept holding me and talking to me all the while. The woman's presence was the only thing that kept me together during those dreadful moments following the seizure. After a while, I don't know how long, I had to walk back up the stairs with the two policemen. It was time to face Colin. I was quite probably still in a deep stupor, because I had no depth perception and no sense of time or place. The world around me was shaky sequence of visual impressions blinking on and off like some disconnected scraps from a film, sometimes shockingly sharp, sometimes fuzzy and depthless. The lights were back on now, and my aura had turned even more somber. The men of the police technique at Scientific were exiting one by one, looking grave and gloomy. Colin wanted me to leave with him right away. A policewoman standing by had a fresh shirt for me. And now, under a light of color of rusty water, I found myself face to face with another form of silence, almost as dreadful as that a while ago, the hush of shocked and shaken men filing out with the dark mark of unreality and disbelief etched into their leaden faces. Colin was as livid-faced and harried as the others, and he appeared to be very much in a hurry. Still, as he addressed me, he managed to come off as almost mild-mannered, and yet the firmness of his mind was starkly visible, in his body language, the relentless urgency of his gaze. He knew the hours ahead were going to be long and crucial. When I could not begin to slip out of my shirt, he unbuttoned it for me and asked his assistant to help me with a fresh one. Even then I sensed an undercurrent of deep disdain in the intensity of his silence. A significant part of this man was the ominous mass of inner outrage that he was capable of using to get things done, a force tightly packed and walled inside him, like insulation material. Among the memories I was able to retrieve after my injury, That first isolated minute outside the building looms like a freeze frame on a screen. And yet even now, as I try to put the scene together, I can still feel in my body powerful residues of the living sensations. I remember quite precisely how I felt out of the sidewalk, the shiver of loss and disorientation that ran through my frame, the stink of exhaust fumes from the idling vehicles on the square, Colin standing close behind the ambulance outside the door, instructing the 2 police officers to take me to his car, his face fiery in the red glow of the taillights. The horrid reality of what had happened and what we were about to do must have dawned on me as I stood there. The realization caused my body to react with fright, and I began to panic and wanted to turn back at the sight of all these vehicles, some of which were starting out ahead of us. At any rate, I certainly resisted following the 2 men to Colin's car and stood on the doorstep, virtually within arm's reach of the ambulance. The 2 officers did not insist, but they kept holding me, while the commissar spoke with one of the paramedics through the passenger's window. Even so, Colin was intent on keeping me out of his way. I think he did not want me to see my sons brought out and taken away. He turned around and barked something at the men, and this time they did force me into his car. And now I was sitting in the back of an idling police vehicle with a driver standing by and 2 officers keeping watch outside. And before long, the man of power who controlled all these men of power got in with his assistant, and we drove off into the early dawn, the last hour of quiet before the city began to stir. The car was racing down the deserted street, yet I remember Rue Saint-Hilaire with stunning intensity, the spikes bristling the spearheads on the fence of the Jardin Plants, the rectangular stone frame of the diminutive corner gate mottled with moss and lichens, the somber mass of trees inside the garden, towering and brooding and forbidding in their height and their gloom, like mounds of charred rags and bones. All of it sliding away behind us second by second as we sped down Rue Buffon towards the Place Faubert and across the Austerlitz Bridge, with the arched iron hulk of the trestle bridge looming farther downstream, the jagged skeleton of a prehistoric beast etched black against the blush wine sky. There are many structures of familiar buildings that come back to me from the fleeting visual impressions of that crossing, buildings and monuments along the riverside that were silhouetted against the first streak of dawn, mental images that I was able to recall with increasing lucidity over time, well before I decided to use our online satellite imagery to trace out the route we pursued. Part of me must have known and retained where I was amid the chaos. We were driving over the same stretch of river that I had crossed with Anaël on our first night out together. Our car glided down the ramp and we swerved left on the Pompidou Expressway, picking up speed again along the Seine, the early barges dark and bristly in the gray water. Then we stop and I can see him, even now, as I try to ride it all out into sense, and I can feel the power and reach of my inner vision as it stretches further and further back, to encompass and magnify even the most marginal details, as if, by sheer mind power, I'm able to conjure up every single step he took across the empty street and up toward the entrance of the prefecture building where I was to be taken for questioning later. The officer waiting for him between the 2 square columns, standing unreal and incongruous by the closed door, with the colors on the becalmed flag above him coming to life and the limestone facade between ash gray and pale red. Colin spoke with the policeman briefly and made a lengthy call on his cell phone. Then we had to leave. We drove back along the river to the east in the Institut Medico-Legal. The driver parked right near the service entrance, and the 4 of us waited outside in the dark of the dark brick structure, just a couple of steps from the door, and right here already, as the city braced itself for another day of suffocating heat, I came face to face with the same thing that had struck me cold in Zoe's corridor. I could smell it again, or perhaps not so much smell it as absorb its chilling power through some unconscious instrument of sense buried deep within me. The rank yet barely within grasp redolence of death, exuded through the walls and windows in sly tentative emanations, like an acrid aftertaste. Here was the place of all endings, then, and yet even as I stood among these gray-countenanced, blank-eyed men, their faces worn thin by the night of inhuman effort that I had inflicted upon them, something wayward and weak in me persisted in its refusal to acknowledge the one truth that mattered, the stubborn fact that my sons were dead, that it was now my paternal duty to face them at last and see them through this horrible passage. The back door opened and a woman appeared, her summer brown face framed in straight blonde hair that enclosed her features like a helmet of gold thread. With her standing in the door now, some of the truth started to sink in and my legs began to give out. As my gaze met the woman's ice-blue eyes, I saw there was an expression of deep sadness in them, or perhaps it was commiseration. She was not dressed in her work clothes, and yet it was obvious that she held a senior-level position at the Institute. The woman greeted us from the doorstep and motioned me in, her face averted in what appeared to be embarrassment. I took my first step forward, with men crowding so close around me that I could feel their bodies press against mine. There were many dim, meandering corridors before we came to the room, which was, as far as I can recollect, vacant and shockingly white under the neon light. The woman was wearing her uniform now, and when she stepped up to the refrigerator after the few formulaic words that she had addressed to me, I failed to follow her and simply stood by the door. I began to shake.